Right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to roll up our sleeves and play historical detective. We're looking at the Indian subcontinent between 600 BCE and 600 CE and trying to decode the actual social realities of the time. We'll be piecing together clues to figure out who really held power, how families were actually structured, and what everyday life was like, not just for the elites, but for ordinary folks too.
Here's our roadmap for unpacking this massive chapter of history. We'll be looking at piecing together the past, decoding the colossal epic, the rules of kinship, marriage norms and realities, and finally, going beyond the Brahminical norms.
So, starting right off with Section 1, piecing together the past, let's look at how we actually approach this methodology.
Think about it for a second. We're facing a massive challenge here. Figuring out what ordinary and even elite lives looked like thousands of years ago, it's not like we can just scroll through their social media or read a diary entry. So how do we uncover these ancient family secrets and hidden societal rules? Where on earth do we even start looking?
Well, we have to start by looking at a landscape of massive change. Between 600 BCE and 600 CE, agriculture was rapidly expanding into forests, craft specialists were popping up, and wealth was getting pretty unequal. To understand how all this economic shifting changed society, historians rely a lot on ancient texts. But, and this is a huge but, we don't just blindly read these old books as pure fact. We have to look at the tension between the strict norms these texts preach and the actual situations they sometimes accidentally let slip. We constantly have to ask, okay, who actually wrote this, and who were they writing it for? And to cross-check the books, we look at rock inscriptions. Those often give us incredible, raw glimpses of real people making actual decisions on the ground.
Moving on to Section 2, decoding the colossal epic. Let's look at one of the greatest texts ever created. Just look at the dynamic action captured here. This depicts a scene from the Mahabharata, which is, hands down, our richest textual source for understanding early Indian society. At its core, it's this colossal epic story about two sets of warring cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. But it's so much more than just a story. It's a massive cultural database. We're talking over 100,000 verses composed over a staggering period of about 1,000 years, starting right around 500 BCE. It's got the central narrative, sure, but it also has these massive sections completely dedicated to laying down the absolute rules of behavior for basically everyone in society. Now, because this text was compiled over a millennium and spread out across an entire subcontinent, it naturally changed and evolved. To actually decode it, an Indian Sanskritist named V.S. Sukthankar kicked off this unbelievably ambitious project back in 1919. The goal? To create the critical edition of the Mahabharata. His team literally scoured the country, collecting Sanskrit manuscripts from Kashmir all the way down to Kerala. They painstakingly compared verses from every single manuscript, selected the ones that showed up in most versions to form the main text, and, this is crucial, they documented all the enormous regional variations. This whole process? It took a mind-boggling 47 years to finish and resulted in over 13,000 pages. And what is so fascinating here is actually seeing the visual evidence of that 47-year labor. See that bold text at the top? That's the main agreed-upon narrative. But look down at the bottom half. Those massive footnotes literally show us the regional variations. In fact, more than half of those 13,000 pages are just footnotes. What that tells us as historical detectives is that there absolutely was not just one rigid, universally accepted way of life. These variations are literally the physical evidence of complex dialogues, disagreements, and compromises between the dominant traditions and the super-resilient local practices of the ancient world. Let's dive right into Section 3, the rules of kinship.
If we want to understand ancient family dynamics, we have to look at what society valued above everything else. This chanting mantra from the Rig Veda, which was probably inserted around 1000 BCE, and, crazy enough, is actually still used in many weddings today, brilliantly captures the ancient societal obsession. It says, "I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love." Producing fine sons wasn't just a preference. It was viewed as an absolute necessity to maintain the family's power, wealth, and spiritual continuity.
And that obsession with sons leads us straight to a fundamental concept, patrilineal. Basically, this is a kinship system where sons claim the resources and, the actual thrones, in the case of kings, of their fathers when they pass away. This was the dominant rule of the era. I mean, the entire central feud in the Mahabharata between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, it's literally a brutal, world-ending war over patrilineal succession to the throne of Hastinapura. Now, while this patrilineal ideal was fiercely reinforced by the texts, history always throws us a curveball. We do see very rare exceptions, like with Queen Prabhavati Gupta, where women actually held and exercised immense political power, but make no mistake, the standard rulebook was definitively patrilineal.
Okay, Section 4, Marriage Norms and Realities.
Now this is where our detective work gets really fun. Around 500 BCE, as cities started booming and people were mixing and sharing new ideas, the Brahmanas responded to all this social shifting by laying down incredibly detailed codes of behavior in texts like the Dharma Sutras and later the Manusmriti. But check this out. It brilliantly illustrates the clash we find within the texts themselves. On one hand, you've got the prescribed, so-called perfect norm. Marriages are strictly arranged by fathers and involve the giving of wealth. But on the exact same page, the texts also acknowledge what they call voluntary practices, unions that spring purely from desire between a maiden and her lover. The very fact that the law books felt the need to categorize these desire-based marriages is proof that the strict codes weren't always being followed. Real life, as always, was way messier than the idealized rules.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 5, Beyond the Brahmanical Norms.
All right, it is time for a major historical plot twist. While the Brahmanical ideal demanded strict patrilineal identity, taking your father's name, the Satavahana kings, who ruled parts of western and central India, completely subverted this. The historical inscriptions we've recovered actually show them using metronomics. That means names derived from their mothers. These kings proudly paraded titles like Gautami Puta, which literally translates to the son of Gautami. Now, it's super fascinating because their actual succession to the throne was still generally patrilineal, going from father to son, but this massive public prominence of the mother's name in their royal titles, it completely defies the standard Brahmanical rulebook we just spent all this time talking about.
And honestly, it goes way further than just naming conventions. The subcontinent was incredibly diverse, and entire populations completely bypassed these dominant rules. You had forest-dwelling communities relying on hunting and gathering, living entirely outside the settled agricultural norms. There were also groups categorized as the Nishada, for instance. This is the community the famous archer Ekalavya from the Mahabharata belonged to, and they existed completely outside the strict Varna or caste system. And because they didn't play by the rules, the dominant Sanskrit texts often harshly labeled these groups as odd, uncivilized, or even animal-like. So what this proves is that ancient history isn't just one monolithic set of rules. It's an ongoing dialogue, and sometimes a pretty fierce clash, between dominant traditions and highly resilient, independent local populations.
So the crucial point we really have to remember as we put our historical evidence file together is that these rules, narratives, and societal clashes, they didn't just happen overnight. They evolved over centuries. Mapping this out on a timeline helps us anchor exactly when these social codes were cemented. We go from the early grammar texts of Panini around 500 BCE through the early Buddhist texts, which, by the way, often heavily question these very norms, right down to the compilation of the Manusmriti stretching into 200 CE. We're looking at a dynamic, shifting landscape of ideas being written, challenged, and constantly rewritten over a 1,000-year period.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with kind of a profound thought. We've seen how ancient Indian societies lived right in the middle of this tension between the strict rules laid down in texts like the Manusmriti and the messy, incredibly diverse realities we find hidden in footnotes and stone inscriptions. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? If historians read our modern texts, our laws, and our social media feeds 2,000 years from now, what are they going to find? Will they just see the rules we claim to follow, or will they be able to dig deep enough to uncover our true reality? Thanks so much for joining me on this historical detective hunt today. Keep questioning what you read, and I'll catch you next time.